This video, we're going to look at just the general organization of the brain, what we're eventually going to be discussing when we talk about the brain. Also, I want to show you kind of the relationship between the ventricular system and structures of the brain, as well as discussion of something called brain lateralization. So we're going to be looking at four major parts of the brain. The cerebrum, which is by far the largest. That's going to be involved in like your personality, voluntary muscle movements, interpretation of senses. So much is taken care of in the cerebrum. And we'll be looking at the cerebral cortex as well as the basal nuclei, which are gray matter. We'll look at the diencephalon, which includes the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the pineal gland, which is part of the epithalamus, plus some associated structures, because we'll also be looking at the pituitary gland. Now, just so you know, when you look at the diencephalon, you see thalamus, which is in this general area right in here. Well, below the thalamus is the hypothalamus, which you see down here. And epi means upon, so the epithalamus, which includes the pineal gland, is above it. The brainstem is another area we're going to look at, so it'll include the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and then we'll also look at the cerebellum. Now, just to give you kind of a frame of reference for different areas of the brain and how it relates to that ventricular system, which is filled with cerebral spinal fluid, I want to show you this coronal section of the brain here, and then here's the model of the ventricular system of the brain. So you see the lateral ventricles over here. That red is that choroid plexus, that is which produces the CSF. So kind of give you an idea of the relationship between the different components of the ventricular system and the brain. So over on this side is the right cerebral hemisphere. Over here is the left cerebral hemisphere. On either side where you see the blue, those are your lateral ventricles. So you have two lateral ventricles. The CSF will travel from those lateral ventricles into your third ventricle. And I'm going to, give me a second. I want to make my thing a little bit smaller. Okay. Third ventricle, by way of this leader line will be the interventricular foramen. From the third ventricle, it will travel to the fourth ventricle through that cerebral aqueduct. So let's look at the parts of the brain relative to it. On either side of those lateral ventricles, you associate with the cerebrum. So that's surrounded by the cerebrum. I do want to make a note of this structure here. That's a tract of white matter called the corpus callosum that allows communication between the two cerebral hemispheres. The third ventricle is surrounded by the diencephalon. So the diencephalon composes the ceiling, the walls, and the floor of that third ventricle. The cerebral aqueduct actually travels down through the midbrain. And on either side of the fourth ventricle, you notice you see the cerebellar hemispheres. So you can kind of see that relationship between that system and structures in the brain. Now here I wanted to show you some various structures or a little bit of the anatomy of the brain. So what I want you to bring note to is you'll see these kind of little grooves. The shallow grooves are called sulcus. The plural for that word is sulci. Where you find deeper ones, we call them fissures. There'll be a few that we'll have to identify. The convolutions, where you can kind of see it's kind of all convoluted here, are called, a singular one is gyrus, the plural is gyri, and there'll be a couple that you'll have to be able to identify. Now, having those convolutions are important in that we can put a lot more gray matter into that. So increases surface area so we can have a lot more gray matter. Now I'm going to show a few of these structures for you that you'll kind of should be aware of. Is over here on the side, right there, that is the lateral sulcus. Down here is something called the transverse fissure. Notice it kind of, and it goes all the way along the back. It's separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. The superior view of the brain, which you see over here, right along here, that is the longitudinal fissure. So if I do a cut, if I actually cut along the longitudinal fissure, I can do a pretty good mid-sagittal section through the brain. You'll also see, I'm going to draw a line here. This is called the central sulcus. So that is the central sulcus, and that will actually divide your frontal lobe, which is up here, from your parietal lobe, which is back here. I'm going to color blue this area right here. That is called the precentral gyrus because it's in front of the central sulcus. It's that convolution. That will be an important landmark. So I'll tell you what we find there later. The green is the post-central gyrus. Again, that's going to be an important location of something that we're going to talk about later. Okay, so just kind of give you some of those things that should be aware of. Just to show you, kind of looking at, say, the cerebrum compared to, say, horse, an alligator, and a shark. If you notice, the horse has a lot more convolutions than the alligator and the shark. So horses have a lot more gray matter than alligators and sharks. And horses have a lot more personality. One would consider them smarter. They can do a lot more than alligators or sharks. Alligators and sharks are all about survival. When's their next meal? That's pretty much it. So there are people who are humans that are born with not as many convolutions as we normally would, and they actually refer to that condition as lissencephaly. They have a smooth brain, and they will have a lot of deficits as a result of it, so much less gray matter that they can contain. One thing I do want to mention is when we look at the cerebral hemispheres, often you'll hear like, oh, she's left-brained, or she's right-brained. Typically, we say someone who's very math-oriented, they're left-brained. Someone who's more creative, they're right-brained. In reality, no one's truly left-brained or right-brained. I have to make that clear. But there are certain things that are taken care of on one side, a little bit more on one side than the other. But before I even mention that or go into that, I do want to bring your attention to some of the things that you see on this picture. Over on the left hemisphere, you see right hand motor control, feeling shapes with the right hand, hearing vocal sounds, right ear advantage. And then over on the right hemisphere, you see left, left, left. Well, it so happens that the left cerebral hemisphere is going to be interpreting sensory information on the right side of the body, and it will control muscle movements on the right side of the body. The right cerebral hemisphere is going to be interpreting sensory information coming from the left side of your body, and it does control muscle movements on the left side of the body. So we will be talking about pathways, motor pathways, sensory pathways, in which there is, in the pathway in which the information is traveling, there's something called decussation or crossing over. That's why you see kind of the opposite control. Now, what I do want to mention is what you see here. On the left side, you see speech. You see superior language comprehension. Well, there is true hemispheric lateralization in regards to speech. So I just want you to be aware of, because we will be discussing it, Broca's area, which is in the frontal lobe. It's typically on the left side, but I think 90% of right-handed people and 70% of left-handed people, it's on the left cerebral hemisphere in that frontal lobe. It is only located on one side of the brain. It's not found on the opposite side. Another area called Wernicke's area right here, that's also it's going to be the same side as Broca's area. And again, typically it's on the left side. Both of them are very important in communication or speech. There were some neurologists back in the late 1800s that noticed that they had patients who had damage to the left side of the brain that had speech or language problems. And these areas are named after those physicians. And we will talk about conditions in which these areas are damaged. So I'm going to, actually, or have that there. I'm going to, we'll just leave it there. We're going to stop here, and then you can move on to the next recording.